If you don't have a process to catch that, you're somewhat flying blind, right? And domain experts don't think about testing, and they don't think about pipelines or DevOps or things like that. A change there creates a lot of uncertainty or nervousness. So what if the code generation doesn't give the same result, or something changed, or if my time criticality changed, does that impact the rest of my system? So being able to prove that, that's one thing we do. And I think also in today's world, you can pick any industry. It's all about failing fast and adapting to change. So the companies that can do that, they iteratively get better, faster, and improve. Many engineering companies always empower their engineers to become autonomous. So groups do what they are most productive to get to the results quicker, and then the tool decisions is not uniform, and then that causes later issues.
Gareth, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Really cool. So last time we did it at the same location, but just one on the ground floor, right?
Right, on the downstairs. So we're here at the high-tech campus at the conference center.
Talk to us a little bit about yourself, your background, and your time at MathWorks, and why you transitioned to found your own company.
Sure, so that's a mouthful. So my name is Gareth Thomas. I'm Portuguese by nationality, born in South Africa, and I've lived in 7 different countries. So as a young child, I traveled for many countries. So South Africa, Netherlands, Singapore, Hong Kong, Macau, Portugal, Scotland, and then I came to the Netherlands. When I came to the Netherlands, I joined the MathWorks. So that was about I was about 29 when I joined, and I worked for nearly 10 years at the MathWorks. And after 10 years at the company, I thought to myself, well, maybe I would like to do something different and new, right? I also became a dad at that time, and I thought to inspire my son to follow his dreams, I wanted to set the example by following my own dreams. So I've always wanted to create my own company, and hence VersionBay was born 6 years ago. And the idea of VersionBay was to help customers migrate from older versions of Matlab to newer ones. And we quickly realized that it just doesn't apply for Matlab, but also Matlab, Python, and Julia.
Okay, why Matlab, Python, and Julia? Like, why the 3?
Well, so it's a bit like in technical computing world, people get kind of almost religious about the computing language that they use. And it's a bit like Apple versus Android. Ultimately, they're smartphones, right? And they're useful, but people are like, oh, my Apple's so much better than my Samsung phone. It's something similar happens with the technical computing. So MATLAB, Python, people also kind of say, I'm a MATLAB person, I'm a Python person. The Julia folk will say, oh, I'm a Julia folk person. I actually believe in learning by looking and understanding other languages. So as soon as I started learning a little bit more about Python and Julia, it actually solidified my own understanding of how MATLAB worked. So even just by exploring another language, you're kind of like cross-checking your assumptions of how you think things work. And actually, because those things are slightly different in the other ecosystems, you can appreciate some of the more subtle things in the MathWorks ecosystem, but also vice versa with the other ecosystems.
I see. Talk to us a little bit about what you're doing at VersionBay. What's the mission and what's the vision of VersionBay?
So the mission of VersionBay is to empower people to use the latest software stacks. So I'm a firm believer that software is changing all the time, so embracing that change is actually a good thing. I know many projects, they like to pin down and lock down their software versions, but you can't do that forever. So I think it's better to have a process in place to encourage people to plan for changing. And that's what VersionBay was born and thought about. So instead of always saying, okay, this works in our 2020, I'm never going to touch that MATLAB version. Actually, you should think about all the cool new things that the 7,000 people at the MathWorks are working day and night. How do you use that in the future versions of your own product? So that's what we thought we would help people with through that process. And I think also in today's world, you can pick any industry. It's all about, like you said, failing fast and adapting to change, right? So the companies that can do that, they iteratively get better, faster, and improve. Simple example, your car. Historically, cars were very mechanical designed. You would buy it and it would be perfect when you buy it, but then you wouldn't need to touch it again. But it feels like in the modern world, what you want, what people demand, is actually a car that by itself changes and adopts and changes. And you can pick any industry. I think that is happening more and more. So part of that change is also the software used to develop these products. So having a good process to embrace that, that's what VersionBay does to help people with.
Now the positioning becomes a little bit more clear, Gareth. Now the question is, maybe it's also a dumb question, right? Couldn't I just click update and everything would update in my MathWorks environment? Like Simulink would be updated, Matlab would be updated. Why do I need you guys?
Well, so there's a difference of installing something that works. So yes, you can install a new version, but often domain experts don't think about testing, and they don't check the numerical accuracy every single new release, right? So it could be, for example, the MathWorks, the linear algebra library changes, or an architectural of a new PC changes, and that might change the fundamental maths. And if you don't have a process to catch that, you're somewhat flying blind, right? And domain experts don't think about testing, and they don't think about pipelines or DevOps or things like that. Whereas a software developer, pure software developer, this comes naturally, but he or she probably doesn't use Matlab, right? So we're trying to bring some of these well-known concepts in software development to domain experts who probably don't care too much about the software architecture per se. They just want to get their insights, but we want to be able to reuse those insights in future generations of their projects, and also making sure that if something does break, you catch it early, as opposed to, okay, the person who created that left the company and now it's got technical debt, and now what do I do? And no one knows, so let's just leave it because we don't want to touch it, and the project manager doesn't want to allocate time. So we kind of quantify the value and reduce the risk of migrating to new versions.
I see. Walk me through some of the case studies that you've been working on at VersionBay. So what was the initial starting point? And then once I started working with you, what's the actual outcome or the return on invest if I start working with VersionBay?
Right, so there's a couple of things that we do. So often people will, we have two types of customers, ballpark for you. One is we will have people who are going from Matlab to Matlab. Given that I used to work at the MathWorks, it's normal that our ecosystem and network started with the MathWorks Center. So that's Matlab to Matlab. So that's an old version of Matlab to a new one. And when you say old Matlab to new one, it depends what people are using. So at university, you use basic MATLAB and some of the toolboxes. That's relatively easy to create unit tests and cater for numerical differences. But the more advanced industries or users of the MathWorks ecosystem will start using MATLAB, Simulink, code generation, maybe the MATLAB compiler, maybe they've got some of the SimScape toolboxes, Stateflow. So the amount of things that are changing are quite high. And when you talk about code generation, going from MATLAB or Simulink to C or HDL, the number of checks you need to have in place are significantly more important, especially in safety-critical workflows, right? So most people think of MATLAB as just like, okay, it's this research tool that you can do some math, but in the automotive and the aerospace industry, where we kind of are predominantly have our customers, they're actually super strict on security and traceability of requirements. Like if there's someone's life depends on something that came from MATLAB, you have to have a very rigorous approach to say that someone said this requirement appears in this MATLAB file, this line of code, the Simulink block, and when I generate C code, it appears on these lines of code, and these test cases check exactly that what I intended my system to do, it actually is doing. So that whole cycle of safety critical is super time-consuming and expensive, and that's where the MathWorks ecosystem really thrives. But because it's complicated, a change there creates a lot of uncertainty or nervousness, because it's like, okay, so what if the code generation doesn't give the same result, or something changed, or if my time criticality changed, does that impact the rest of my system? So being able to prove that, that's one thing we do, right? So that's on old MATLAB to new MATLAB. There are, however, certain industries which, for different reasons, maybe more on the AI front, which might not think of MATLAB as the go-to environment. Mm-hmm. So thinking maybe of the finance world, it used to be very strong with MATLAB, but they never use Simulink. They don't have necessarily the same safety critical requirements. So Python in the age of AI is actually a common approach. So it's actually similar methodology to go from MATLAB to Python. How do you check the numerically the same results? And then we help customers migrate to newer versions of code bases. So you're changing a language, and that's not necessarily because of the technical reasons, but it could be for hiring purposes, or AI is perceived to be better at language as Python. And then, companies take different decisions. So that's another category of our customers that we have.
Yeah. It feels like what you're explaining is kind of common sense, but what do you think companies are missing? Why don't they catch these mistakes or these problems in the first place?
Well, they do it when it goes to production. Mm-hmm. So if something is directly correlated to production, they typically have some kind of process around that.
Yeah. But it's very costly probably, right?
It is, yeah. So it's super costly, especially when things are there and it's like, oh no, if only we had known. Usually you need a kind of an internal disaster before an investment takes place to fix this ahead of time. That's okay. But the other part of it is MathWorks tooling is really great for certain things. The people who naturally use it are domain experts, and it's not part of their DNA to think about version control, testing. That's usually an afterthought, whereas maybe a software developer whose life depends on making things that go into production, they think very seriously about testing up front. The average Matlab user thinks of testing after the fact, and that's a bit of where people come from. Typically mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, mathematicians, physicists. They touch software development, but they're not really experts because their focus and their education and training is on a different domain.
Yeah. Do you recommend because they're technically buying the service like from a third party, right? Let's say I'm going to study mechanical engineering once again.
Yeah.
Do you think there needs to be at least one course on software development practices for engineers or electrical engineers?
I think it would be a really good step forward.
Yeah.
That being said, it's hard to change academia because if you want to change something, you have to take something out. And it's always very difficult to say, okay, this is no longer needed and this other course or this other topic is more important. So if you go to an electrical engineer and you say, to the dean of engineering, say, okay, I think you should add more software. And he says, okay, great, software carpentry skills, so what do I take out? And you say, what? We take out maths? Well, he's under pressure to say that the level of maths should be higher anyway. Okay, so you can't touch the maths. And then hardware. Oh, what are we going to... Electrical engineers need to know a little bit of hardware. Okay, circuit design. Okay, can't take that out. So it's really difficult to remove things. And often what happens is it just relies on the passion of individuals more than anything else.
And I think probably when you study, it's probably not clear what the software development best practices are actually for in the real world.
Well, that's the other thing, right? They're testing you on maybe your skills on theoretical skills more than getting things into production, right? It's actually a tough call to make, even though I think it would be useful. But the fact that it doesn't exist means it's good business for VersionBay, so I'm okay with that.
Yes, so you also help upskill whole departments or industries or like industry segments.
Exactly. Well, the other thing that we also do is part of the problem why this upgrading is a difficult thing is most companies actually don't have a good understanding of how many different versions of Matlab are running in the first place. So you could think of Matlab grows typically bottom up, so Department A uses it in a specific domain, Department B, then Department C, and then it slowly but surely grows up. But that means that each of these departments are somewhat autonomous and therefore have different tool chains. Mm-hmm. And then you have a variation of versions of Matlab, and that becomes a problem. So the other thing that we do is we start off by measuring which versions of Matlab are used across the entire organization. And then that gives you a data point to say, okay, now I know which versions are used, but also which toolboxes are used. And then the more advanced users say, actually, we should be investing more or we should be investing less. And then having some kind of solid data actually makes it a much stronger starting point to this migration issue. Because let's say you want to go from an old version to Matlab to a new one, mm-hmm. You need to know which is the old version, what is the variation, and which is the new one, right? And even if you say, hey, I want to go from Matlab to Python, then someone in IT will say, okay, so how many people are still using Matlab? We can't just stop paying for this, because then people will be angry. How do I get a hold of it? And internal surveys are like, that doesn't work, because every engineer will say, yeah, don't take my tools away. It doesn't matter if I need it or not. So we also sell products on measuring the usage of the MathWorks tooling, looking forwards and looking backwards. So you could also do it with looking at log files if you wanted to, but we do it also in real time, so you can see at any point in time which department's using what for how many hours, and that's a cool insight to have as an organization.
Does it also have disadvantages if you track that kind of stuff?
It does. So in the land of the blind, one eye is king, right? So with the absence of this information, then you don't take additional actions. So with this information, it forces you to think about, okay, now we have to have a process for upgrading, right? So if an organization up until that moment never had a process for upgrading, the data makes it painfully clear that you need it. Now you need to allocate time to get that process going, align stakeholders. So you could say that's not a good thing because now you've got unplanned activities that you didn't want. But on the plus side, once you go through it a couple of times, it actually is very useful, just like any other programming language goes through.
Okay, let's say you solve a specific problem for your customers. Your job is basically done, or does a new problem occur that you can then solve using like with your company?
Well, so what usually happens is also you can identify weak spots of usage, and we also help people saying, giving recommendations of like, okay, in this area maybe you could be using this. We noticed in that other side of the company they're doing these things, using these toolboxes. Maybe you should do that. So at a corporate level, we help with the data, and then we kind of help at a smaller team level, specific activities, and that could be either training, proof of concepts, and they might say, okay, maybe for this application, is MathWorks the right tool, yes or no? And we help demystify some of these assumptions, because people might say, I heard Python's great, but maybe it's actually not the solution.
Yeah.
Sometimes a proof of concept goes a long way.
I'm interested how you get into these companies, because probably word of mouth, because you've built your reputation over the last years, being very proficient in Matlab. I'm wondering, how do you get into these companies in the first place? Do you talk to decision makers directly? Do you have a reputation already established? How does that work?
So there's a couple of ways that we come in. So we organize meetups. So that's one thing that we kind of do, and more in the Eindhoven area, we kind of create a framework for the Matlab users to kind of come out, but the same for the Python users and the same for Julia. So even though talking a lot about Matlab, the story is actually somewhat similar for Python and Julia. So that's one way as a bottom up. The other thing is clearly on our website, we tackle a very niche area. So upgrading versions of software. There are many consulting companies, but not many of them focus on this, right? So we have web leads and that's all good. The other thing we also do is we organize webinars. So we recorded sessions and that generates leads. But where we kind of get some leads is actually on the product side. So before you start talking about migrating, there's usually an IT holder or a budget holder, say an admin for the MATLAB licenses. They are interested in measuring it. So we get in touch because the person who has to decide, do I buy more or less, or do I renew yes or more? They're actually often blindsided of what's being used. They reach out to us. We help them with that. And then through that discussion, we start understanding that person is connected to both procurement, IT, and the development of the engineering. And through that person, we kind of network our way through the organization.
I see. Okay. Do you have to kind of provide some kind of ROI calculation to the decision maker?
So when it comes to the license usage, yes, we do that. So it becomes very clear relatively quickly. But ultimately, people know that if they want to be serious about MATLAB, Python, and Julia, whatnot, the domain experts are categorically known for being weak in software carpentry skills. So helping have a process for domain experts to make less mistakes and not reinvent the wheel, it ultimately pays off very quickly.
Are you adding friction to the system by integrating processes, or is it actually less friction over time? Depends on what time scale you're probably looking at.
Yeah, so some people don't like this, but most engineers typically are curious beings by nature. So learning a new skill, and if you put it underneath, okay, it's maybe under DevOps, this is a cool thing, I should learn about it. Deepening their understanding of testing, version control, pipelines, and things like that is nice. And as long as people get the idea that you're reducing the time from idea to production, if you're reducing that friction, people like it. Even if you add a bit more processes on top, but you're making life easier downstream. So as long as that is clear to people, they tend to accept it, right? It's like, because, a domain expert, I've got this great idea and I have to wait 3 years for my idea to make it to the market. That's crazy. Well, okay, if we add a bit more structure, you want to do a bit like what Facebook does, right? Every few minutes, there's a new version of Facebook or Instagram being pushed out. And it's possible to create largely complex systems with very quick turnarounds. But if you think of a car, people think, no, we can't do it in 15 minutes. That's crazy. So that's kind of what we're trying to help people through.
Got it. Okay. So you're an expert in MATLAB, Julia, and Python. Let's say someone is listening to this podcast and they don't really know what path they want to take. It obviously depends on what problem they're trying to solve. Do you have some kind of pros and cons, kind of a comparison between the three tools, and what probably you would advise to people listening to the podcast, what path they should take? But I guess it really depends on the problem they're trying to solve. A CFD problem is different than...
Exactly, yeah. So the obvious answer depends.
Yeah.
But that's also part of the reason why I have my own podcast, because I interview people in the different domains, and I'm also trying to figure out where the boundaries are of where it's good or not to go from one environment to another. But I think there's two ways of looking at it. If you look at it purely from a business perspective, or if you look at it from a technical perspective, right? So I'm going to start off on the technical side, and then I'll go to the business side. So technically speaking, MathWorks ecosystem is really, really strong in the automotive and aerospace. And the reasons for that is the safety critical workflows. So their tool chain is certified by authorities, so that if you want to use Matlab in developing, I don't know, a safety system or an ABS system or self-control system in a car, that workflow is accepted, right? Same goes for trains, airplanes, right? So they call that model-based design. Model-based design angle, whereas you're not just programming Matlab, but you're using Simulink and models, and they reuse models for multiple things. That has a huge payoff for large companies, right? So that's very different to the open source world where Python and Julia are thriving. But I think on top of Matlab, the Simulink angle is super, super strong, and actually, I would argue Python and Julia don't really compete there. So the model-based design area, MathWorks, really, really great, specifically for testing purposes. And the thing that people often forget about is the code generation. So to go from take a Kalman filter and push a button and have that appear on any microcontroller, DSP or FPGA or PLC, that is super, super powerful. So that saves companies tremendous amounts of money. That being said, there's a cost of the licenses, right? And some of the stuff is hidden. Then if you look at the Python ecosystem, there's some good and bad things about it. The good is huge community, super strong in AI, but not only AI, right? So Python is typically good for web infrastructures, websites, fast API is an example, Django. I don't know how many websites are powered on the backend by Python, but then there's the data science angle. A lot of AI is used with Python. And then Python has also been used historically for gluing different programs together. So their standard library comes with every operating system, significantly better than, bash scripts or something like that. So those three areas of Python and the tremendous ecosystem around it makes it exceptionally attractive for people to learn. And as a result, people often put Python on their CV, that then in turn lends itself to easier to hire people. So that triggers the business angle of why would you use Python versus Matlab. But if you focus on Python, the language, one of the deltas is you say Python, but the ecosystem, for example, in technical computing, like NumPy, it's not written in Python. It's written in C++. So many of the well-known packages are not written in Python. They're written in other languages. Just Python is a wrap around it, right? But it's super easy to use, huge community, and it just works. So I would actually argue for numerical crunching. Python as a language is slow. The fact that people use other languages underneath the hood to make it fast, making it comparable to Matlab, that's kind of a strange thing to have, right? But it is well known in AI. So you can go to any AI meetup conference and the word Python means something. If you say Matlab, people will say, well, maybe not the go-to. Even if technically, I don't think it's such a big discrepancy. And then there's the Julia side of things, which is came out of more of mathematicians. So Julia comes out of MIT, and the idea was to take all the bad from MATLAB, Python, and R and throw that away and keep the good of it. It is a super fast language, but it has got a steeper learning curve to learn, and it attracts the people who are challenging the status quo. So the people who are attracted to Julia are catalysts of change inside organizations, which is good in many ways, but it also triggers change, and the ecosystem is not as developed as MATLAB or Python, but the numerical computations, wicked fast. And the key thing that I like about Julia is most of the libraries are written in Julia. So when the core language improves, the whole ecosystem improves. In Python, if the core language improves, only the subset of the ecosystem that uses pure Python benefits from that. So Julia has a improvement scalability thing much faster. That being said, it's not supported as well by the Microsofts, the Amazons for scalability and cloud infrastructure. So it's a bit of a thing there. But I think if you think on pure optimization mathematical problems, Julia really good. I think the world generally accepts Python as AI is the go-to framework and for web service. And I think MathWorks is super strong for automotive and aerospace model-based design. This is my rule of thumb of where the ecosystems work together.
That's good.
There obviously are exceptions.
Yeah, you can probably cut out this clip just as a standalone clip for YouTube then, like Python versus Matlab versus Julia. I'm wondering, was there also at some point in time the case where you advise people or companies to say, okay, maybe move away from Matlab for a specific purpose or move away from Python and use the other language instead?
Yeah, so I've got examples of both directions.
Yeah.
So moving away from Matlab, one example was in financial sector, where there's one department only using Matlab, but there were 5 other departments using Python. And yeah, the other departments were putting in place infrastructure, internal libraries for the Python workflows to be more solid. And this one department, they felt out that they were losing out. So effectively said, for what you're doing, there is an equivalent in Python. It may not be as good as what you're doing, but there is an equivalent, and it streamlines the whole process of all departments online, makes IT happier. So that was an example from financial institution where that was working. There's also the other way is sometimes was more of a control application area where MathWorks is very strong, but the team was under pressure to explore Python because the rest of the organization was using Python. And then effectively we kind of proved out that, MathWorks was significantly better than the Python ecosystem, and said, no, what we should be doing is making sure that the other folk should not be using Python, because actually it's a suboptimal development. So both in execution, both in debugging, documentation, reliability, there's strong reasons why you would actually choose MathWorks over Python. Right?
Yeah, we talked about this during lunch a little bit, like what's common sense to you is not common sense to others. Why do you think they started with kind of this weird language constellation of like, maybe we use Matlab and then later on we just throw it away and use Julia instead, for example? Why do you think that is? People don't have the experience, or is it not that obvious to them?
Well, I think it actually comes off where the languages are born. So Matlab historically came out of, so Cleve Moller, yes, he was a mathematician, but a lot of the founders of the MathWorks come from an engineering background. So electrical mechanical engineering, that place is super strong. And then as MathWorks grew, it then branched out into other domains like sciences, financial institutions, and so forth. But it kind of started off as more of an engineering thing that then grew. Whereas Julia came out more of the mathematicians, and then as it grew in features, it started overlapping. So I think the reason why there's this wild ecosystem is different backgrounds are attracted to certain languages, and then they create a new one, and then it starts interbreeding, and then each of these languages, they grow, and they start overlapping more and more. And then what happens is large companies, they've got every language there, C, C++, Java, Math, and it's actually a living nightmare for IT and infrastructures to say, come on, we've got like 20 different languages, we've got 2,000 software vendors. It's not an uncommon thing that large organizations say, can't we cut down on some of this? I mean, do we have to have all of this? But many engineering companies always empower their engineers to become autonomous, so groups do what they are most productive to get to the results quicker, and then the tool decisions is not uniform, and then that causes later issues.
What's the better way to go about this? To have a process in place where everything is regulated, which probably sucks for the end user, because there's more regulation in place, versus being autonomous dynamic system where you just do whatever you want, but then you have a weird dynamic holistically?
I think it depends on the DNA of companies.
Okay.
So the founders of a company will set the DNA. Some companies are more process-driven, and they have to be based on where they are. Others are more about, no, let's explore new things, let's be creative. And if that's the environment, you naturally fall into this place of your team will be happier if you let them choose the tools that they want versus forcing them something else. And if that's the type of person you're hiring, you can't say, no, you shall use this version. And it's actually painful because some people will say, oh, I'm using a 4-year-old version of Matlab. That's like 8 versions behind. That makes you feel bad, right? And then some people just do not accept that, and they'll go and find a job another place. But there are other people who will say, man, we can't always be changing these 10 different languages. I'd rather have a process, so there's a bit of a balance. But I think what is nice is it's not either or. You can use both. There's ways of interrupting between the different environments. Not many people are aware of it. It is a little bit more work, but ultimately, all these languages, both MATLAB, Python, and Julia, if you can bring in C, and you have C level, and that's the common denominator, and it's okay. And people in production, they can live happily with C, so there's definitely ways of collaborating. but it's just a matter of maybe defining interfaces, and defining interfaces is a software development skill domain experts typically couldn't care less about. So I can't say which is better. I think it just comes down to DNA of teams and how they're structured historically more than anything else.
Yeah. One of the last questions I have for you, Gareth, is what are some of the misconceptions people have, especially in the industry, around MATLAB, Julia, and Python?
Yeah, so let's start with MATLAB. So people say MATLAB is terrible for AI. It's not the case. They've got some pretty cool things, and the added value is the code generation. So if you want to take an AI model, generate code, and put it on a device, I think the MathWorks ecosystem is super strong there, and that's a misconception there. Let's talk then a bit about Julia. Julia, there's a misconception that it's only for purely mathematical operation. That's not the case. Their ecosystem is growing really quickly. They have lots of cool things. Symbolic calculations is definitely possible, but it's not only great for mathematical things. They even have a very fast web server, for example, which will give many Python frameworks a run for their money. So Genie.jl, that's kind of a cool thing. So if you go to a Julia conference, you'll be amazed of the variety of applications that Julia's used outside pure mathematics. Then the Python ecosystem is, people often think that Python is slow. I don't think Python is slow, but there's also a misconception that Python is Python. So you should think of Python as an easy user interface for many languages. So when you're saying you're programming Python, it's not always the case that it's pure Python underneath the hood. So I think those are my three general misconceptions that I see all the time around Python. Oh, the other one on Python is people say that Python is super easy. Their environments is not easy. I mean, that's not so nice. I mean, you have to set up your environment, and then you have different versions, and most people are not aware of that, and that's painful to get right. I know there's folk at Asterel, which are creating UV to make life a little bit easier, but Python being easy, it's not the easiest thing. Even though you try to teach kids that, this environment thing is a little bit hard to get your head around. So I think it's just easy. Just install MATLAB, that version, things are good. The Julia ecosystem got that one also nice with their REPL. It's nicely integrated with their environments. I think they did a really good job there.
Really cool. Is there anything we missed in this podcast, Gareth, that we might have missed?
Not really. I think this is cool. Lots of good stuff here.
Yeah, cool stuff. How can people find you? How can they get in touch with you?
So I'm very active on LinkedIn. So I prefer people come to my LinkedIn, reach out to me. If they want to check out my podcast, Inspiring Computing, that's also fine if they're curious to hear some of these war stories of different users of MATLAB, Python, and Julia. Or if you're interested in our products, come to the company, go to the VersionBay.com and send us a message, contact us. Happy to be in contact and help people make best use of their software.
Excellent. That was smooth. Thank you so much, Gareth.
There we go. It's good. Thank you.
Good stuff.